The morning light filters through the grimy windows of Cafe Pushkin, casting pale shadows across the worn wooden tables where Elena Volkov moves like a ghost between the scattered patrons, her threadbare apron tied around her slender waist as she balances 3 steaming cups of coffee on a tray that has seen better days, much like everything else in her world, including herself. And she can feel the weight of unpaid bills crushing down on her shoulders like a heavy coat she cannot remove her mother's medication costs echoing in her mind as she navigates through the cramped space between tables where construction workers and office clerks sit hunched over their newspapers, speaking in hushed tones about the economic crisis that has gripped Moscow by the throat. And Elena knows that crisis intimately because it lives in her empty stomach and her sleepless nights. But she forces a smile onto her lips because tips depend on cheerfulness even when your heart is breaking, and that's when the door chimes with a sound so sharp it cuts through the morning murmur, like a blade, and she glances up to see him standing there, like a dark angel descended from another realm entirely. Dmitry Romanov, in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably costs more than she makes in a year, his presence filling the humble cafe with an electricity that makes the very air seem to vibrate with danger and power. His coal black hair swept back from his face, revealing aristocratic cheekbones and a jawline that could have been carved from marble by masters, but it's his eyes that steal her breath away completely, those piercing ice-blue eyes that seem to see straight through her soul and catalog every secret she's ever kept, every dream she's buried beneath the weight of survival. And Elena feels her hands begin to tremble as she watches him survey the cafe with the calculating gaze of a predator choosing his territory, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the scuffed linoleum floor as he moves with the fluid grace of someone who has never doubted his place in this world, never questioned whether he belongs, and she realizes with a sinking heart that men like him don't accidentally wander into places like this, which means he's here for a reason, and that reason terrifies her in ways she cannot name. So she steadies her grip on the coffee tray and approaches his chosen table by the window, her pulse hammering against her throat like a caged bird desperate for freedom, and she can smell his cologne now, something dark and expensive that speaks of boardrooms and private jets and a world so far removed from her own that it might as well exist on another planet. And when she leans forward to place his coffee cup on the table, her hands are shaking so violently that disaster becomes inevitable. The hot liquid splashing across his pristine suit jacket in a brown cascade that seems to happen in slow motion, each drop landing like a bomb on fabric that costs more than her monthly rent. And the silence that follows is so complete she can hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she stares in horror at what she's done, waiting for the explosion of rage that will surely follow. But when she finally finds the courage to meet his gaze, she sees something that shocks her to her very core. Because yes, there's fury there, white-hot and dangerous, making his blue eyes burn like Arctic fire. But beneath that rage there's something else. Something that makes her stomach clench with an emotion she doesn't recognize, something that looks almost like fascination, as if he's seeing her truly for the first time and finding something unexpected in her terrified face. And when she opens her mouth to apologize, the words come out stronger than she intended, laced with a defiance that surprises them both because Elena Volkov has spent her entire life apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for needing things she cannot afford. But something about this man's penetrating stare awakens a pride she didn't know she possessed, and she lifts her chin and looks him directly in those devastating eyes as she says she's sorry, but she won't grovel, won't beg for forgiveness like a kicked dog, because she may be poor but she still has her dignity, and she watches something shift in his expression, watches the fury transform into something far more dangerous, something that makes her skin burn and her breath catch in her throat. And she expects him to make a phone call that will have her fired within the hour, expects him to unleash the full power of his wealth and influence to crush her like an insect. But instead, he does something that stops her heart completely, reaching into his jacket pocket with movements so deliberate and controlled that she cannot look away, pulling out a wallet that probably contains more money than she'll see in her lifetime. And without breaking eye contact, without saying a single word, he places bills on the table, not just enough to pay for his ruined coffee, but enough to cover her mother's medication for an entire month, enough to keep them afloat for weeks. And the gesture is so unexpected, so impossibly generous that Elena feels tears prick at the corners of her eyes. But she blinks them back because she won't cry in front of this dangerous stranger who's just turned her world upside down with a single act of inexplicable kindness. And when he stands to leave, his Movements are fluid and predatory, like a panther preparing to strike, and as he passes by her frozen form, she catches another whiff of that intoxicating cologne, feels the heat radiating from his body despite the expensive fabric that separates. For 7 consecutive mornings, Dmitry Romanov arrives at Café Pushkin at exactly 8:15, his presence transforming the humble establishment into something electric and dangerous. And Elena finds herself watching the clock with an anticipation that terrifies her, her heart beginning its frantic rhythm the moment his sleek black Mercedes pulls up outside. Because she knows that in moments he will walk through that door and turn her carefully constructed world upside down with nothing more than a glance from those devastating ice blue eyes that seem to strip away every defense she's ever built around her wounded heart. And when he takes his usual table by the window, the same spot where she first spilled coffee on his pristine suit, she can feel his gaze following her every movement like a physical caress, burning through her threadbare uniform and making her skin flush with a heat that has nothing to do with the steam rising from his espresso machine. And she hates how her hands tremble when she approaches his table, hates how her voice catches in her throat when she asks if he wants his usual black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just bitter darkness that somehow seems to match the shadows lurking behind his perfectly controlled exterior. And each morning their conversations grow longer, more intimate, filled with verbal sparring that crackles with unspoken desire and dangerous undercurrents that pull her deeper into his orbit despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. Because men like Dmitry Romanov don't just appear in the lives of women like Elena Volkov without consequences, without prices that must be paid in blood and tears, and she can see the predatory intelligence in his eyes as he studies her with the focus of a hunter who has found his perfect prey, asking seemingly innocent questions about her life that somehow manage to uncover all her secrets, her sick mother's mounting medical bills, the crushing weight of debt that keeps her awake at night, the dreams she's buried beneath the necessity of survival. And with each revelation, she watches something shift in his expression, something that looks almost like possession, as if he's cataloging her vulnerabilities and filing them away for future use. And she realizes with dawning horror that she's becoming addicted to these morning encounters, to the way he makes her feel alive and dangerous and desired in ways she's never experienced before, even as every instinct she possesses warns her that loving a man like him will destroy her more completely than poverty ever could, because power and wealth are his weapons, and she is defenseless against the dark magnetism that draws her closer to his flame, even as she knows it will consume her. And then on the 8th morning, everything changes when Viktor Petrov and his crew of local thugs swagger into the cafe with the arrogance of men who believe they own the world, their leather jackets and gold chains marking them as predators of a different sort, the kind who feast on the desperation of those too weak to fight back. And Elena's blood turns to ice when Victor approaches her with that familiar predatory smile and demands protection money, his voice carrying threats that make her stomach clench with fear, because she knows what happens to those who refuse, has seen the broken windows and bruised faces of shop owners who dare to say no, and she can feel Dmitry's presence behind her like a gathering storm can. Sense the shift in the cafe's atmosphere as conversations die and patrons begin to edge toward the exits, sensing the violence that hangs in the air like smoke. And when Victor reaches out to grab her wrist with fingers stained with other people's blood, Elena braces herself for the pain and humiliation that will surely follow. But instead, she hears a voice that could freeze hell itself. Dmitry's words cutting through the tension like a blade forged in Arctic fire, and she turns to see him, rising from his chair with movements so fluid and controlled that they seem almost inhuman, his expensive suit doing nothing to hide the lethal grace of a man who has walked through darker valleys than any of these street thugs could imagine. And when Victor turns to face this new threat, Elena sees something she's never witnessed before, watches as recognition, and then pure terror flood the thug's features, because apparently even bottom feeders know better than to cross Dmitry Romanov. And what happens next unfolds with terrifying efficiency, Dmitry's voice never rising above a conversational tone, as he makes it clear that anyone who threatens what belongs to him will discover exactly why his name is whispered in fear throughout Moscow's underworld, and the casual way he mentions specific details about Victor's family, his address, his children's school schedules, sends a chill through the cafe that has nothing to do with the morning air, and Elena watches in fascination and horror as grown men reduced to cowering children in the face of Dmitry's controlled fury, his protective instincts revealing cracks in his icy facade that both thrill and terrify her. because she realizes that she has somehow become something precious to this dangerous man, something worth protecting. And when the thugs flee like whipped dogs, their tails between their legs, Dmitri turns to her with eyes that burn with possessive fire, and she can see beneath his perfect control to the savage need lurking in his depths, the primal desire to claim and protect and possess that makes her knees weak and her heart race with equal parts fear and longing. And she knows in that moment that she's crossed a line from which there can be no return, that whatever game they've been playing has transformed into something far more dangerous, something that will either save them both or destroy them completely, because the power between them shifts like a deadly dance neither can resist drawing them inexorably toward a collision that will shatter both their carefully constructed worlds and leave them with nothing but the burning need that connects their souls across the vast chasm of wealth and status that should have kept them forever apart, but instead only serves to make their forbidden. The Moscow storm descends upon the city like the wrath of ancient gods, turning the streets into rivers of chaos as Elena hurries through the downpour clutching her mother's medication from a pharmacy, her thin coat offering no protection against the icy rain that cuts through fabric and flesh alike, and she's thinking about the morning's shift at the cafe, about the way Dmitri's eyes had lingered on her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter with dangerous butterflies, when fate intervenes in the form of his sleek black Mercedes pulling up beside her like a dark angel materializing from a storm, and through the rain-streaked window, she sees him leaning across the leather seat, his ice-blue eyes filled with concern that seems to pierce straight through her waterlogged defenses, and despite every rational thought screaming at her to refuse, to maintain the safe distance that has kept her heart intact, she finds herself sliding into the warm sanctuary of his car, surrounded by the intoxicating scent of leather and his expensive cologne that makes her head spin with forbidden desires, and when he suggests taking her to his penthouse until the storm passes, she knows she should insist on going home to her cramped apartment, should preserve the careful boundaries they've maintained during their morning cafe encounters, but something in his voice, a vulnerability beneath the commanding tone, makes her nod in agreement, and 20 minutes later she stands, dripping in the marble foyer of his penthouse apartment, her eyes wide with wonder at the luxury that surrounds her like a fairy tale made manifest, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Moscow's glittering skyline, priceless artwork adorning walls that seem to stretch toward heaven itself, and she feels like an intruder in this palace of wealth and power, her worn clothing marking her as someone who doesn't belong in this rarefied world. But then Dmitri is moving toward her with that predatory grace that makes her pulse race, his hands gentle as he helps her out of her sodden coat, his fingertips brushing against her skin and sending electric shocks through her nervous system. And when he wraps her in a cashmere throw that probably costs more than she makes in 6 months, she can't help but lean into his warmth, can't resist the tender way he tends to her rain-soaked body, his usual mask of cold control slipping to reveal something achingly human beneath, and she finds herself studying the sharp angles of his face in lamplight, memorizing the way shadows play across his aristocratic features, the way his dark hair falls across his forehead making him look younger, more vulnerable, and when their eyes meet across the intimate space between them, she sees her own longing reflected in those icy blue depths, sees the careful restraint that has been holding them both back beginning to crumble like ancient walls, and the first touch of his lips against hers is gentle, questioning, as if he's giving her one last chance to flee before they cross the point of no return. But Elena has spent her entire life running from her desires, denying herself even the smallest pleasures, and she's tired of being afraid, tired of letting poverty and circumstance dictate the boundaries of her heart. So when he deepens the kiss, she responds with a passion that surprises them both, her hands fisting in his expensive shirt as years of suppressed longing explode between them like a dam bursting. And she can taste desperation on his lips, can feel the tremor in his hands as they frame her face with reverent care, and when thunder crashes outside the windows like the sky itself is shattering, they come together with the violence of colliding stars, all pretense and careful distance burned away in the fire of their mutual need, and makes love to her with a tenderness that brings tears to her eyes, his powerful body trembling above her, as if he's afraid she might disappear like smoke, his whispered endearments in Russian falling like prayers against her skin, and she discovers that beneath his ruthless exterior beats the heart of a man capable of devastating gentleness, capable of worshipping her body like she's something precious and sacred rather than just a poor waitress from the wrong side of Moscow. And as rain lashes against the windows and lightning illuminates their entwined bodies, Elena feels her carefully constructed defenses shatter. Completely, feels herself falling into an abyss of love so deep and consuming that she knows there will be no climbing back out. And in the aftermath, as they lie wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets that feel like silk against her skin, she watches him sleep and marvels at how peaceful he looks, how the harsh lines of power and control have softened into something almost boyish, and she realizes that she has seen behind the mask, has glimpsed the wounded soul that hides beneath his armor of wealth and influence. And when morning light filters through the storm clouds and he opens those devastating blue eyes to look at her, she sees something there that makes her heart both shatter and soar, sees a vulnerability that he's never shown another living soul, a desperate need that matches her own. And she knows that no matter what comes next, no matter what price she'll have to pay for this forbidden surrender, she would make the same choice again in a heartbeat, because some things are worth risking everything for, and the love burning between them is a force of nature more powerful than any storm, more dangerous than any consequences they might face. And as he pulls her close and murmurs her name, like a benediction against her hair, Elena understands that they have crossed a line from which there can be no return, have bound their souls together in ways that neither time, nor circumstance, nor the vast gulf between their worlds will ever be able to sever completely. 3 weeks after their storm-soaked surrender in his penthouse, Elena's world transforms with what she believes is miraculous fortune, beginning when the hospital calls to inform her that an anonymous benefactor has paid her mother's mounting medical bills in full, every single ruble that had been crushing her spirit under its impossible weight. And she weeps tears of gratitude in the sterile hospital corridor while her mother sleeps peacefully for the first time in months, unaware that the man responsible for this miracle is the same one whose kiss still burns on Elena's lips every night. And when designer dresses begin arriving at her cramped apartment with no return address, each one more beautiful than anything she's ever dared to dream of owning, she tells herself it must be some wonderful mistake by the universe finally deciding to smile upon her. Even as her heart whispers Dmitri's name with each silk caress against her skin, and he plays his part perfectly, acting. Surprised when she appears at their usual cafe table wearing couture that transforms her from working-class waitress into something ethereal and breathtaking, his ice-blue eyes darkening with possessive satisfaction as he takes in every detail of his secret handiwork, the way the emerald green dress brings out the gold flecks in her eyes, the way confidence blooms across her features like flowers opening to sunlight. And soon he's introducing her to Moscow's glittering elite at charity galas and private exhibitions, his hand never leaving the small of her back as he guides her through crowds of Russia's most powerful families. And Elena feels like Cinderella stepping into a fairy tale, overwhelmed by crystal chandeliers that cost more than her annual salary and champagne that sparkles like liquid diamonds. But she can feel the weight of curious stares and whispered gossips following her every move, can hear the barely concealed speculation about who this nobody is and what hold she has over the notoriously ruthless Dmitri Romanov. And though she lifts her chin with pride that surprises even herself, part of her withers under the scrutiny of women who were born into this world of privilege and power, who wear their wealth like armor and their beauty like weapons, and she wonders what they see when they look at her, whether they can smell the poverty that still clings to her soul despite the designer perfume Dmitri bought her. But when his fingers intertwine with hers and he murmurs reassurances in her ear, his voice a dark velvet caress that makes her forget the hostile glances, she feels invincible, feels like she could conquer any battlefield as long as he's beside her. And he introduces her to wonders she never knew existed, private boxes at the Bolshoi, where she watches Swan Lake with tears streaming down her face as the tragic beauty unfolds before her, helicopter rides over Moscow's ancient skyline that make her feel like she's flying through her own impossible dreams, weekends at his dacha, where they make love in front of roaring fireplaces while snow falls like blessing outside frost-covered windows. And she realizes that she's not just falling in love with him, but with the life he's shown her, the version of herself that exists in his rarefied world, confident and radiant and desired. But even in their most intimate moments, when he holds her against his chest and she can feel his heart beating beneath her cheek like a promise, she senses shadows lurking beneath his perfect facade, catches glimpses of darkness in his eyes when he thinks she isn't watching, conversations that end abruptly when she enters a room, phone calls taken in hushed Russian that make his jaw clench with tension she doesn't understand, and sometimes she finds him staring out his penthouse windows at the city below with an expression so haunted it makes her blood run cold, as if he's carrying burdens that would crush a lesser man. And when she asks about his past, about his family, about the source of his vast wealth, his answers are polished and evasive, revealing nothing of substance, while his eyes warn her not to dig deeper, not to disturb the carefully constructed mythology he's built around himself. And Elena feels her growing love becoming tinged with a fear she can't name, a creeping suspicion that she's living in a beautiful illusion that could shatter at any moment, leaving her with nothing but the memory of what it felt like to be cherished by a man who might be far more dangerous than she ever imagined, because she's noticed the way his security team watches her, the way certain topics make his expression go blank and cold, the way he sometimes touches her like he's memorizing the feel of her skin for when she's no longer there, and she begins to understand that paradise always comes with a price. That fairy tales are built on foundations that might not be as solid as they appear, but when he kisses her goodnight with desperate intensity, when he whispers her name like a prayer against her throat, when he looks at her like she's the only light in his dark world, Elena pushes down her doubts and chooses to believe in the love burning between them, even as part of her soul whispers warnings about the dangerous game they're playing and the devastating reckoning that might be waiting just beyond the horizon of their stolen happiness. The first sign of danger comes in the form of photographers lurking outside Elena's apartment building, their cameras clicking like hungry insects as she hurries past with her head down, and she can feel the shift in Moscow's elite circles, the way conversations die when she enters rooms, the way predatory smiles replace polite nods. Because word has spread through the city's power brokers that the untouchable Dmitry Romanov has found himself a weakness, a poor waitress who has somehow managed to crack the armor around his ruthless heart. And Viktor Kozlov, Dmitry's most vicious business rival, watches this development with the calculating gaze of a shark sensing blood in the water, his own empire built on the ruins of those foolish enough to show vulnerability in Russia's cutthroat corporate landscape, and Elena feels the weight of hostile attention like ice in her veins, understanding instinctively that she has become a target simply by existing in Dmitry's orbit, by daring to love a man whose enemies would use any weapon to bring him down. And when she voices her fears to Dmitry over dinner in his penthouse, she watches his expression transform from tender concern to something cold and lethal, his ice-blue eyes hardening into Arctic fire as he assures her with deadly quiet that no one will touch what belongs to him. And the possessive way he says those words both thrills and terrifies her, because she realizes she's witnessing the true extent of his power, seeing glimpses of the ruthless king who rules Moscow's shadows with an iron fist wrapped in expensive silk. And 2 days later, she accidentally discovers just how far that power extends when she arrives at his office unannounced with lunch and finds him in the middle of destroying Viktor Kozlov's construction empire with surgical precision, his voice calm and controlled as he makes phone calls that will cost his rival millions, as he activates networks of influence she never knew existed, and she watches in fascination and horror as he systematically dismantles a man's life's work in retaliation for the crime of noticing Elena exists. And when he realizes she's witnessed this display of his darker nature, something vulnerable flickers across his features, as if he's afraid she'll see the monster beneath the man and flee in terror. But instead Elena finds herself moving closer, drawn by the complexity of this dangerous stranger who can be tender and brutal in the same breath, who protects her with the same merciless efficiency he once used to build his empire. And that night, as they lie entwined in his bed, she asks him about the shadows she sees lurking behind his eyes, about the nightmares that make him cry out in Russian in his sleep. And after a long silence filled only with the sound of their synchronized breathing, he begins to speak in a voice so raw it makes her heart break, telling her fragments of his childhood in Siberia, where his father's fists taught him that weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford, where watching his mother die slowly from his father's brutality while he was too small and powerless to stop it forged something hard and unbreakable inside his soul. And she understands finally why he moves through the world like a predator, why control means everything to him, why the thought of losing her to his enemies fills him with a terror that has nothing to do with business and everything to do with the broken boy who learned too young that love equals vulnerability equals death. and she holds him against her heart as he confesses that she's become his greatest weakness and his most precious treasure, that loving her has made him more dangerous than he's ever been because now he has something to lose, something worth killing for, and Elena feels their love deepening even as she senses the walls closing in around them, feels the weight of his obsessive protection like golden chains that bind her to his side, beautiful and suffocating, and absolutely necessary because she's beginning to understand the brutal mathematics of their situation, that being Dmitry Romanov's woman means accepting that she'll never be safe, never be free from the crosshairs of his enemies, never exist as anything other than a weapon that can be used against him. And yet when he kisses her with desperate hunger, when he whispers her name like a prayer against her throat, when he looks at her like she's the only light in his dark kingdom, Elena knows she would choose this dangerous love again and again, would rather live one day as his cherished obsession than a lifetime of safety without him. Because some hearts are meant for war zones, some souls are designed to love warriors, and as dawn breaks over Moscow's ancient skyline, she makes peace with the knowledge that their fairy tale romance has transformed into something far more perilous and precious. A love story written in blood and shadow, and the unbreakable bond between two people who have found in each other the only thing worth fighting for in a world determined to tear them apart. Elena's discovery happens by pure accident, a cruel twist of fate that begins when she arrives at Dmitry's penthouse early with his favorite coffee and finds him gone, his security team mysteriously absent, and she decides to wait in his study where she spent countless evenings curled in his lap while he worked. But today something is different. Today, the massive painting of Moscow's skyline hangs slightly askew, revealing the outline of a hidden door that her curious fingers find and press. And the wall slides open with a mechanical whisper to reveal a room she never knew existed, a sterile chamber filled with monitors and filing cabinets and walls covered with photographs that make her blood turn to ice in her veins, because staring back at her from those walls are images of herself from years before she ever met Dmitry, surveillance photos taken when she was still a teenager working at her first job, walking to school, visiting her father's grave, and her hands shake as she moves deeper into this shrine to her own existence, this catalog of her life that proves their meeting was never the beautiful accident she believed it to be. And then she sees the files, manila folders thick with documents bearing her father's name, and with trembling fingers, she opens the first one to find police reports and newspaper clippings about the car accident that destroyed her childhood, that left her and her mother alone and struggling. And as she reads through the papers with growing horror, a pattern emerges that makes her stomach clench with nausea, because the accident wasn't random at all. It was carefully orchestrated to eliminate Alexei Volkov, a construction foreman who had witnessed something he shouldn't have, who had become a liability to the Romanov family business empire, and the documents spell out the brutal mathematics of her father's murder with clinical precision, detailing how the brakes were tampered with, how the timing was calculated to look accidental, how a good man died because he had the misfortune to see Dmitry's father disposing of a rival's body in a construction site foundation, and Elena's world shatters around her like glass as she realizes that the man she loves, the man who has shown her paradise and made her believe in fairy tales, is the son of her father's killer, that every kiss they've shared has been built on a foundation of blood and lies, that she's been sleeping with the enemy while her father's ghost cries out for justice from his unmarked grave, and she's still holding the damning photographs when she hears Dmitry's footsteps in the study, still staring at evidence of his family's crimes, when he appears in the doorway of his secret room with an expression that shifts from confusion to understanding to devastating despair in the space of a heartbeat, and when their eyes meet across the wreckage of her shattered trust. Elena sees his carefully constructed mask slip completely, sees the raw anguish of a man who knows he's lost the only thing that ever mattered to him, and she confronts him with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she demands to know if he knew, if their entire relationship has been some sick game of cat and mouse, if he's been laughing at her all this time while she fell in love with her father's destroyer, and his desperate attempts to explain only confirm her worst nightmares because, yes, he knew who she was from the moment he walked into her cafe. Yes, he orchestrated their meeting. Yes, he paid her mother's medical bills out of guilt for what his family had done. But no, he never expected to fall in love with her, never planned for his cold heart to crack open and bleed for a woman whose life his family had destroyed. And she watches him fall to his knees before her, this powerful man who commands armies of lawyers and soldiers, reduced to begging for forgiveness from the daughter of his victim, and his words pour out like blood from a wound, telling her how he spent years trying to atone for his father's sins, how finding her was supposed to be reconnaissance but became salvation, how loving her has been both his greatest joy and his most exquisite torture because he knows he doesn't deserve her, knows that every moment of happiness he's stolen has been paid for with her father's blood, and Elena feels her heart breaking in ways she didn't know were possible, feels the beautiful dream of their love, transforming into a nightmare that will haunt her for the rest of her life, because how can she love a man whose family destroyed hers? How can she forgive the son for the father's sins? How could she trust anything he's ever said when their entire relationship was built on lies and manipulation and blood money? And when he reaches for her with hands that shake with desperation, she recoils as if his touch burns, seeing not her tender lover but the heir to a legacy of violence and betrayal. And the look in his eyes when she pulls away from him will haunt her dreams forever, because she sees the exact moment when his soul shatters, when the last hope dies in those ice-blue depths that once held promises of forever, and Elena realizes that some betrayals are too deep to forgive, some sins too dark to absolve, some love stories too cursed to survive the weight of truth. And as she walks away, Elena flees Moscow like a wounded animal seeking darkness to die in, boarding the first train heading east with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart shattered into pieces so small she wonders if it will ever beat properly again. And as the Trans-Siberian Railway carries her away from the city that holds every memory of Dmitri's touch, she stares out the frost-covered windows at the endless expanse of Russian wilderness and tries to convince herself that distance will heal what betrayal has destroyed, but even as thousands of kilometers stretch between them, she can feel his presence like a phantom limb, can sense his obsession reaching across the frozen landscape to claim her soul, and she knows with sick certainty that a man like Dmitry Romanov doesn't simply let go of what he considers his, doesn't accept defeat when it comes to the woman who has become his greatest weakness and most consuming addiction. And 3 weeks later, she finds herself in Norilsk, a remote Siberian mining town, where the sun doesn't rise for months and the cold cuts through flesh like knives, working in a cafe so different from her Moscow life that it feels like stepping into another world entirely, serving bitter coffee to weather miners and lonely truckers who don't ask questions about the haunted woman who appeared one day speaking perfect Russian but carrying secrets in her eyes that make even hardened men look away. And she tells herself she's finally safe, finally free from the golden chains of Dmitri's love, but her nights are filled with dreams of ice-blue eyes and desperate kisses, and she wakes each morning with tears frozen on her cheeks and his name dying on her lips. And the local villagers begin to whisper about the strange city woman who cries herself to sleep, who flinches at sudden noises and jumps whenever the cafe door opens, as if expecting demons to walk through. And Elena tries to build a new life from the ashes of her old one, but she's like a ghost haunting her own existence, going through the motions of living while her heart remains buried in a Moscow penthouse with a man whose love was poisoned by blood and lies. And then the investigators arrive, subtle as shadows but impossible to miss for someone who has learned to live in constant fear, men in expensive coats asking casual questions about newcomers to town, showing photographs that make Elena's blood turn to ice because she recognizes the surveillance techniques, the methodical approach of hunters who never give up once they've caught the scent, and she knows her time is running out, knows that Dmitri's obsession has followed her across continents like a homing beacon locked onto her soul, and she considers running again, boarding another train to another nowhere town where she can disappear like smoke, but part of her is tired of running. Tired of living like a criminal when her only crime was loving a man whose family destroyed hers, and on a night when the aurora borealis paints the sky in shades of green and gold, when the temperature drops so low that her breath crystallizes in the air, Elena is closing the cafe alone when she feels it, that familiar electricity that makes her skin burn, and her heart race with equal parts terror and desperate longing, and she turns to see him standing in the doorway like a dark angel materializing from a frozen wilderness, his expensive coat dusted with snow and his ice-blue eyes burning with the fire of a man who has crossed half of Russia to reclaim what belongs to him, and their reunion is explosive, all the rage and pain and undeniable desire that has been building between them for weeks erupting like a dam bursting, and she wants to run, wants to scream, wants to curse him for hunting her down like prey, but instead she finds herself moving toward him as if drawn by invisible chains. And when he speaks her name, it sounds like a prayer and a curse rolled into one, his voice raw with the agony of separation and the triumph of finally finding his lost treasure. and she realizes in that moment that no distance can sever the toxic bond that chains their souls together. That loving Dmitry Romanov has marked her in ways that transcend geography and logic, that she can flee to the ends of the earth, but she'll never escape the gravitational pull of their cursed connection. And when he reaches for her with hands that shake with need and desperation, she doesn't pull away this time. Because she understands finally that some loves are inescapable, some bonds too strong to break even when they're forged in blood and betrayal, and as the aurora dances overhead like the gods themselves are witnessing their reunion, Elena surrenders to the terrible knowledge that she belongs to this dangerous man in ways that have nothing to do with choice and everything to do with the cosmic joke of fate that bound her heart to the son of her father's killer. Elena returns to Moscow 6 months later, not as the broken woman who fled in the night, but as something harder and more dangerous, her heart encased in ice that she's convinced herself will never thaw again, because she's come back not for love but for justice, armed with copies of every document from Dmitry's secret room, and a burning need to see the Romanov Empire crumble for the sins of the father. And Viktor Kozlov welcomes her into his web of conspiracy with predatory delight, seeing in her pain the perfect weapon to destroy his most hated rival, providing her with resources and connections to expose the corruption that runs like poison through Moscow's power structures. But when Elena finally sees Dmitry again at a charity gala where she's infiltrated as Victor's companion, the sight of him stops her heart completely, because this isn't the dangerous king she left behind. This is a broken man who looks like he's been carved hollow by grief, his once immaculate appearance, showing cracks that reveal the destruction beneath. His ice-blue eyes dulled with a pain so profound it makes her chest tighten with unwanted sympathy, and she watches from across the glittering ballroom as he moves through conversations like a ghost haunting his own life, surrounded by luxury and power, but utterly alone. And when their eyes meet across the crowded room, she sees him freeze as if struck by lightning, sees something flicker to life in those dead blue depths that makes her carefully constructed armor of hate begin to crack, and she has to remind herself why she's here, has to focus on the mission of vengeance even as her treacherous heart starts beating in patterns she recognizes from their stolen nights together. And over the following weeks, as she plays her dangerous game, gathering evidence and feeding information to prosecutors while pretending to be Victor's devoted mistress, she begins to discover disturbing truths about what Dmitry has been doing in her absence, learning from whispered conversations and financial records that he's been systematically dismantling his own empire, selling off properties and liquidating assets not to hide evidence, but to funnel money toward causes that would have made her father proud, funding orphanages and medical facilities and scholarship programs for children from broken families. And she realizes with growing horror that his self-destruction isn't strategic but spiritual, that he's been performing penance for his family's sins by destroying everything his father built, as if he believes that suffering enough might somehow resurrect the dead and earn him absolution for crimes he didn't commit but inherited like a curse. And when she confronts him in his penthouse office late one night, slipping past security with skills Victor taught her, she finds him staring out at Moscow's lights with a bottle of vodka and eyes that hold the weight of the world, and he doesn't seem surprised to see her. Doesn't even turn around when she enters, just speaks her name like a prayer to God who stopped listening long ago, and she demands to know why he's destroying himself, why he's throwing away everything he built, and his answer shatters the last of her resolve, because he tells her with quiet devastation that nothing he built was worth having without her, that every success tastes like ashes when the woman he loves looks at him like he's a monster, that he'd rather be a penniless nobody than a wealthy king if it meant she might someday forgive him. And Elena feels the line between love and hate blurring as she realizes that her revenge has become meaningless because Dmitry is already destroying himself more thoroughly than any prosecutor ever could. And when he finally turns to face her, she sees tears tracking down his cheeks like silver streams, sees the vulnerability he's never shown another living soul. And despite everything, despite the blood between them and the lies that built their foundation, she finds herself moving toward him as if drawn by invisible threads, and when he reaches for her with shaking hands, whispering her name like it's the only prayer he remembers, she doesn't pull away because she understands finally that some connections transcend logic and morality, that loving someone doesn't always make sense, but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you human. And as they come together in his empty penthouse, surrounded by the ruins of his empire and the ghosts of their shattered dreams, Elena realizes that the line between vengeance and vulnerability has disappeared completely, leaving only two broken souls clinging to each other in the darkness, while Moscow burns around them like a funeral pyre for all their impossible hopes. Elena could feel the heavy silence pressing against the windows of the abandoned villa where they had taken refuge, the darkness outside alive with shadows that seemed to breathe like predators circling their prey. And though Dmitri stood tall and unyielding in the dim light, there was a heaviness in his eyes that betrayed the truth he could not speak aloud, that everything he had built, every empire of steel and glass, every ruthless deal that had once made him invincible, was crumbling into ashes because of her plan. A plan that had been meant to destroy him, to strip him of power and pride, but had instead ensnared her heart in the cruelest twist of fate. She watched him as he poured himself a glass of whiskey with hands that trembled only when he thought she wasn't looking, his broad shoulders tense beneath his shirt, the perfect image of a man used to commanding empires, but now reduced to a hunted fugitive. And yet even in his ruin, there was a magnetism she could not resist, the dangerous pull of a man who had once been her enemy, but who had become, through fire and betrayal, the only man she could not imagine losing. "They'll come at dawn," he said, his voice low and rough, each word soaked in resignation and resolve, and when his gaze lifted to meet hers, Elena felt the sting of tears burn her eyes because she saw not fear but acceptance, the acceptance of a man who had already chosen to sacrifice everything, even his freedom, even his life, to shield her from the consequences of her vengeance. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she hadn't asked for his protection, that she had only wanted to see him fall. But the truth burned bitter on her tongue, because she knew that somewhere along the line her thirst for revenge had dissolved into something far more dangerous, a love she could not admit without tearing herself apart. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stepped closer, her thin dress clinging to her body from the damp air, and his eyes darkened with that familiar fire that always left her breathless. "It was never a choice," he answered, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of her hair from her face, lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that contradicted every ruthless act she had once despised in him, and the touch made her heart twist violently because she knew this night was the last they would ever share. The villa seemed to hold its breath around them, the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece loud and merciless, marking the seconds that carried them closer to death or separation, and in that suspended eternity Elena felt her walls collapse, her pride shattering under the weight of the desire that had been building like a storm between them since the first night he had kissed her not as an enemy, but as a man desperate to claim what he could not control. She threw herself against him, her lips trembling as they found his, tasting the bitterness of whiskey and the heat of longing, and his arms crushed her against his chest as if he could fuse her to him and defy the dawn itself. The kiss was violent, desperate, soaked in all the words neither of them could speak, and when he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the cold, rumpled bed in the corner, she knew that this was not a night of love in the ordinary sense, but a night of surrender, of two souls burning themselves to ashes in one final blaze before the darkness consumed them. His touch was both tender and ruthless, his hands mapping every inch of her skin as if he wanted to memorize her, and she clung to him with equal ferocity, her nails digging into his back, her body trembling with the rawness of passion and terror, because each gasp, each kiss, each whispered name was a plea against fate itself. The room filled with the sound of their mingled breaths, the rhythm of their hearts beating like drums of war, and outside, the wind howled as though echoing the storm that raged within them. She whispered his name, begging him not to leave her, even though she knew the price had already been set, that when dawn came his rivals would come for them, guns in hand, vengeance in their hearts, and all his power would not save him. Yet for those hours suspended between night and morning, they belonged to no one but each other, their bodies speaking the truth their pride had always denied, that love born from hate was the most dangerous love of all, a flame that could never last but burned hotter than anything else. When it was over, when their bodies lay entwined beneath the thin sheet and their skins still glistened with the sheen of passion, Elena pressed her face against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, clinging to the sound as though she could trap it inside her, terrified of the silence that would follow if it were ever taken from her. "I was wrong," she whispered against his skin, the confession breaking free at last, and he tightened his arms around her as though he had been waiting for those words all along. "No, Elena," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you were the only thing I ever did right." The clock struck 5, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness, and with it came the chilling certainty that their time had run out. She lifted her head, staring into his eyes, and for the first time, she did not see the billionaire, the enemy, the untouchable man who had once seemed so far above her. She saw only the man who had given her everything, who had chosen her over the world. And in that moment she knew that love and destruction were no longer enemies, but threads woven into the same tapestry of fate. Paris in winter wrapped itself in silence, the narrow streets dusted with snow that fell in slow, deliberate flakes, and Elena stood inside her small but thriving restaurant, the warm golden lights reflecting against the frosted glass as the scent of roasted garlic and simmering wine drifted through the air, a far cry from the blood and shadows of Moscow that had once defined her life. Yet even after 5 years of building this sanctuary brick by brick, memory clung to her like a scar, whispering his name in the dark corners of her mind, Dmitri, the man who had ruined her, saved her, and imprisoned her heart in chains that no time or distance could break. She told herself she had moved on, that the polished wine glasses, the laughter of patrons, the stability of her business were proof that she had finally chosen life over chaos. Yet every letter that had crossed the oceans, smuggled through cold prison walls, and inked with words raw enough to cut her open, reminded her that she had never been free. That love, as destructive and beautiful as theirs, cannot be buried under Parisian charm or safe routines. She remembered the first letter, trembling hands opening it in her tiny flat above the restaurant, his handwriting fierce, unyielding, every sentence laced with longing and regret, words that confessed not weakness, but an obsession that refused to die. And though she had tried not to answer, she had failed, pouring her soul onto paper, telling him of her days, her nights, her dreams of him despite the cage that kept them apart. For 5 years their love had survived as ink and paper, fragile threads binding two souls separated by bars and oceans, and each letter had been both salvation and torment, proof that distance could not erase what was written into their very blood. Tonight, as the first true snow of December painted Paris white, Elena polished the last glass, ready to close, when a shadow fell across the doorway, and though her mind told her it was impossible, her heart knew before her eyes lifted. And there he stood, Dmitri Volkov, no longer the untouchable billionaire whose empire had ruled Moscow, but man broken, thinner, his face carved with the hard edges of survival. Yet his eyes, those stormy, merciless eyes, still burned with the same fire that had always undone her. For a moment she could not breathe, could not move, the sound of her own heartbeat roaring in her ears, because it felt as if time had folded in on itself, bringing back the night he had kissed her in desperation, the morning he had surrendered his freedom for her, the letters written like prayers, and now he was flesh before her again, snow clinging to the black coat that framed his broad shoulders, his lips parting, as if speaking her name alone cost him the last of his strength. "Elena," he said, his voice roughened by years of silence, and she dropped the glass, hearing it shatter against the tiled floor, but she did not care, because her legs carried her forward before her mind could stop her, and suddenly she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, leather and cold air and something deeply familiar, and he held her as though he had been starved, his body trembling with the force of a man who had lived only for this moment. She pulled back just enough to see his face, tracing the scar near his jaw with trembling fingers, her tears blurring the sight of him, and whispered, "You shouldn't be here," but the truth was that she had prayed for this, dreamed of this, every night, and he knew it, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, bitter and tender all at once. "I was released early," he said, though his tone carried the weight of bargains made in darkness, compromises that had cost him more than he would ever confess, and there was nowhere else to go. Her heart ached with the contradiction of it all, the safe life she had built, staff who depended on her, customers who adored her cuisine, a reputation that was finally her own, suddenly fragile in the presence of the man who had once torn everything apart, yet no safety, no peace, had ever made her feel as alive as she did with him standing in front of her. She wanted to push him away, to scream that he had destroyed her life before, that loving him was madness, but instead her fingers gripped the front of his coat, pulling him down to her lips, and their kiss was not gentle but consuming, years of hunger and despair colliding in a single desperate embrace, and the taste of him was both poison